House Committee on Small Businesses published a scathing report finding evidence of taxpayer-funded censorship in the Global Engagement Center, a counter-messaging operation of the State Department created during President Barack Obama's final year in office, confirming previous reporting by Racket News as well as the Washington Examiner. Now, independent journalist Matt Taibbi said the State Department was guilty of censorship and profound corruption.
The committee wrote earlier this month, quote, "The federal government has funded, developed, and promoted entities that aim to demonetize news and information outlets because of their lawful speech." The committee added that the GEC circumvented its strict international mandate by funding private contractors with domestic censorship capabilities. Joining us now to discuss is Matt Taibbi of Racket News. Thanks, Matt, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So this organization, and there's so many of these alphabet, various funded groups that are, some are explicitly government, some are nonprofits, some are associated with think tanks or academic departments. So it's all confusing, I think, very much deliberately in order to, mask the source of this, which is often actually just the government. But talk to us about what happened here. I know the Global Disinformation Index as the organization that threatened one of my own employers, Reason Magazine, where I also write, said we were an unsafe, a risky news website. They said that to, I think, the Federalist and Daily Caller and some other places like that, and with the goal of persuading advertisers not to work with these sites based on alleged sins that were just totally invented, totally made up, were not accurate, were themselves misinformation, which I called out, and then they quickly changed their mind about that. But describe how this was actually, at the root of it, was government action.
Right, so the Global Disinformation Index, the GDI, that is a UK-based private or quasi-private organization. And this is a very common pattern, by the way, with this whole disinformation scheme, which is that you'll find something, an NGO or some kind of organization that exists outside the United States, but if you trace its funding back, you'll find that it's getting money from the American government. In this case, the money came from the GEC, not the GDI, the GEC, which is the Global Engagement Center, which is a wing of the State Department, which confusingly, from its beginnings, was actually mostly funded by the Department of Defense. But essentially what you're describing is exactly right. So there's the State Department money that is going to a foreign media scoring operation that not only downranks companies according to their safety, but also has something called a dynamic exclusion list, which is just a fancy word for a blacklist, which it again circulates to advertisers and the biggest ones like Google, so that they can then essentially cut off sources of revenue for disfavored media outlets. Now that's explicitly part of their mission, is cutting off revenue as a source for these unsafe outlets. So you have basically an American department which is funding economic damage to American companies, and essentially they're doing this because they're not promoting a point of view that the government would like.
American taxpayers might be surprised to learn that they're paying their government to provide funds to a foreign organization to advise censorship of American citizens' opinions. This is an incredibly complicated situation to end up to do some run around the First Amendment. So this came up in this House report, which was able to confirm not just a lot of what you've talked about here, but also that you and Gabe Kaminsky, who's done a lot of good work on this at the Washington Examiner, there was an attempt to discredit your looking into this.
Yeah, this didn't make me terribly happy. I mean, one of the things we found out as this report came out is that the State Department, in briefing this committee, had some things to say about me personally. They were trying to discredit my reporting by talking about my past, mentioning specifically that I lived in Russia and some unsavory behavior on my part during that time. That's another taxpayer-funded activity I'm not sure I feel very positively about, is having the government tried to discredit reporting that's legitimate and factual, using personal smears and that sort of thing. But they also did some sneaky things with Congressman Jim Banks, who had written a letter complaining about this same activity. There's a memo that the committee uncovered talking about Banks with a list of talking points about how to respond to him. And one of them does a very sneaky thing. It quotes him in RIA Novosti, which is a Russian news agency, but the quote didn't come from RIA Novosti. He never talked to RIA Novosti. RIA Novosti took that quote from the Washington Examiner, which is the real source of the quote. So they're trying to create the impression that this congressman was talking to Russian sort of state news agencies, which I thought, that has shades of McCarthyism to it. Very unpleasant, the whole thing.
You also, in your recent piece describing what is going on, you again remind your readers that the moderators at Twitter, who again were the last link in the chain of the attempted censorship, is the State Department funded forces trying to persuading social media moderators that they should take action against pieces of content. And again, you point out that there was actual incredible initial skepticism on the point of the moderators at the company, with Yoel Roth describing the methodology as shoddy and bogus, calling attention to some of these are Russian bots being wrong. It's now been proven to be wrong, totally, the Hamilton 68 list. But that over time, they didn't change their mind. They didn't eventually decide, the State Department and all these forces are right about this. They just decided the cost to them of refusing the government was getting to be too high.
Yeah, and this is a complicated story, and it's one of the harder things to follow in the Twitter files. But essentially, the Global Engagement Center is a relatively new organization in the government. As you mentioned, Barack Obama created it by executive order in 2016. In its previous incarnations, it was a counter-terrorist organization that mostly focused on countering the messaging of groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But they turned inward, and they started to look more at domestic speech and domestic operations. And that's why they got into the business of doing things like funding groups that would disfavor or downrank American media outlets. Now, when they came on the scene, there was already a relationship between Twitter and the FBI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, even the Department of Homeland Security. Twitter essentially had gone through a lot of struggle, and it had sort of let these people in the door of their content moderation process and didn't want to let in this new organization. They thought they were shoddy. They thought their methodology was poor, that they jumped to conclusions, that they were politicized. A great example was, that one of the examples they brought up was, if you're in the yellow vest, that equals Moscow controlled to them, right? So they would just make these leaps of logic that if you are associated with a certain point of view, then that means you're in Moscow's, what they call information ecosystem. It's sort of a guilt by association tactic that Twitter didn't agree with, but they just got so much pressure in the end from other government actors and from lobbying from the State Department that finally they just had to give in, and they allowed the Global Engagement Center to join this sort of spiraling group of government agencies that had a say in moderating content.
Matt, it's not a surprise. Many people talk about shadow banning, especially since 2016, for any folks that may be challenging, mainstream institutions. And I felt it, you felt it, I'm sure you felt it too. With that being said, there's also this other issue that these digital platforms have, in that they're not transparent with their algorithms. There are definitely a lot of fake accounts out there boosting certain narratives. So to me, what I find bizarre about this is, the government, we have free speech in this country and it should be protected. But simultaneously, we have platforms that are pushing certain speech higher up in the algorithm for folks to see more, and other speech may just not get out there. And also the weaponization of bots by all different types of actors, domestic, international, everyone does it. Corporations do it. So why wouldn't the U.S. government just deal with that issue so that they don't have this complicated, money funneling scheme with poor methodology that could get somebody on on a banned list when they just happened to be wearing a yellow vest that day?
Well, I think they view the private status of these corporations as a positive, because essentially it allows them to outsource activity that would normally be blatantly unconstitutional to private corporations that they have very intricate relationships with. So in the case of all of these internet platforms like Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, any of them, Google, they're all very heavily reliant on essentially government subsidies to exist. And so when the Senate Intelligence Committee or the Global Engagement Center or the Department of Homeland Security knocks on their door and says, hey, we want to get involved in content moderation, the companies don't really have a lot of latitude to say no. They can kind of put up a little bit of a fight about it, but ultimately what they end up getting is this situation which is perfect for them, for the government from a legal point of view. We don't have to take the drastic step of doing something baldly constitutional and exercising prior restraint on tens of thousands of posters who are saying things we don't like. We can just sort of nudge the company in that direction, and they can do it, in their mind, completely legally. I would argue that that is illegal and that the fights over that continue. But I think the government wants this arrangement. I don't think they want to focus just on the narrow issue of actual foreign bots and actual bad actors. I think they want to expand their purview into all sorts of different kinds of speech, and this framework allows them to do that very easily and unfortunately with tremendous efficiency.
Matt Taibbi, thank you so much for joining us. Always our pleasure.
Thanks for having me on.